Billionaire CEO overhears Black Janitor's song in empty office. Her voice unlocks his hidden past, a past that would change him forever. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The glass and steel monolith of Sin Tech Solutions pierced the sky, a monument to cold, hard logic and ruthless ambition. Julian Vance, its CEO, was the architect of this kingdom. At 38, he was a study in controlled power. His suits were always bespoke, his movements precise, his gaze unyielding. He didn't walk so much as glide through the pristine corridors of the 40-story tower, a silent, solitary king in his domain. Emotions for him were liabilities, messy variables that had no place in the clean equations of profit and loss. He had built his life on their exclusion. On this particular evening, the city below was a glittering tapestry of headlights and street lamps, a world he looked down upon from the sterile quiet of his corner office. The merger with quantum dynamics was nearing its final stages. A deal of this magnitude required his full attention, an all-nighter of spreadsheets and legal jargon. The air was thick with the scent of recycled air and expensive coffee. He was in his element, a place of order and absolute control. He was deep in a pivot table, analyzing projected market share, when a sound filtered through the oppressive silence. It was faint at first, a wisp of a melody, but it held a warmth that felt utterly foreign in this environment. Julian paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. It wasn't the usual white noise of the building's ventilation system, nor the distant hum of the city. This was a human sound, a voice. He listened, a frown creasing his brow. The melody was simple, yet profoundly beautiful. It was a lullaby, sung in a language he didn't recognize. The voice was a rich, deep contralto, each note a perfect, resonant bell. It was a sound that didn't belong in the corporate cathedral he had built. Intrigued and a little annoyed by the disruption, he stood up and moved to the door. The sound seemed to be coming from the main atrium on the ground floor. The atrium was a vast, cavernous space, with a soaring glass ceiling that looked out onto the night sky. Usually, it was a showcase of sleek, minimalist design, a testament to Sin Tech's forward-thinking brand. Tonight, it was a repository for a different kind of beauty. Julian descended in the private elevator, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and curiosity. He had never heard anything like this. The melody was strangely haunting, like an echo from a place he couldn't remember. As he stepped out, the voice became clearer, wrapping around him like a physical presence. It was so full of emotion, of sorrow and hope, that it seemed to fill the entire space. He followed the sound, his footsteps silent on the polished marble floor. His eyes scanned the deserted space. He saw her then, a small figure standing near a polished steel column. She was a black woman, a janitor, her uniform a stark contrast to the gleaming surroundings. Her hair was tied up in a colorful wrap, and she was pushing a mop lazily, her movements slow and rhythmic. Her eyes were closed, and she was completely lost in the song, a world of her own creation within the sterile confines of his. Her name, he would later learn, was Alina, but at that moment she was just the source of the voice, a voice that was doing something strange to him. It wasn't just a sound, it was a sensation. It bypassed his intellect, his well-guarded defenses, and went straight to a place he hadn't known existed. It was a place of memory, or at least the ghost of one. A flicker of an image flashed in his mind, a small boy, no older than 4 or 5, sitting on the floor with a woman. He couldn't make out her face, but he could feel her warmth. She was rocking him gently, singing a song. The melody, he was certain, was the same. A cold shiver ran down his spine. It was the first time in over 30 years that he had a memory of his childhood that wasn't a carefully constructed narrative. He had always been told his mother died when he was young, and his father, a man of industry, raised him with a stiff upper lip and a focus on success. There was no mention of a woman who sang to him, a woman whose voice could unlock a forgotten part of him. He had always believed his past was a blank slate, a sterile space from which to build his future. But now this voice, this janitor's song, was painting over that emptiness with a vibrant, disturbing color. Julian felt a powerful, almost primal urge to retreat. This was a breach, a violation of the safe, ordered world he inhabited. This woman and her voice represented a threat to the foundation of his entire existence. He couldn't let her see him. He couldn't let her know the chaos she had just unleashed within him. He turned and walked away, the melody still ringing in his ears, leaving a trail of questions he had no idea how to answer. The merger, the spreadsheets, the numbers, they all felt trivial now, dwarfed by the single, profound mystery of a woman's voice and the past it had so effortlessly, so beautifully resurrected. The song pursued Julian Vance into the quiet sanctum of his office, a ghost in the machine of his meticulously ordered life. He sat back down at his desk, but the spreadsheets and financial models that usually provided him with a sense of clarity now seemed like gibberish. The numbers blurred together, and the projected market share felt utterly meaningless. All he could hear was the melody, a delicate, persistent thread weaving through the silence of his mind. He tried to shake it off to force his focus back onto the merger. He was Julian Vance, a man of logic and reason. A sound, no matter how beautiful, could not derail a multi-billion-dollar deal. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, attempting to center himself. But with his eyes closed, the mental image became sharper. A small, dark-skinned woman with a kind smile, holding him, singing softly. The scent of cinnamon and something floral, the feeling of safety and warmth. The images were fragmented, like a shattered mirror, but the feeling was potent and undeniable. He stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring out at the city lights. He saw his reflection, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, a man with a blank past. His father had always told him his mother, a gentle but fragile woman, had died shortly after his birth. He had no memories of her. The family housekeeper, a stern and silent woman, had raised him. The past was a closed book, a chapter his father had sealed with a sense of finality. He had been taught that looking back was a weakness, forward was the only direction. But this song, it had opened the book, and a page was now fluttering in the wind. The melody was a key, a perfect fit for a lock he hadn't known was there. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. This lullaby, sung by a janitor in his own building, was not just a random tune. It was the same one his subconscious had just resurrected. Julian's mind, which usually dealt with complex algorithms, was now grappling with something far more intricate: memory and emotion. He went to his private library, a section of his office filled with art and literature he had collected for prestige, not for pleasure. He began to search, his fingers flying over the spine of books on music, folklore, and history. He was looking for the song, for anything that could explain why it felt so deeply personal. He used his company's internal servers, running a query on any personnel with connections to West Africa, but the results were too broad and felt too intrusive for a direct approach. The obsession took root and began to blossom in the barren landscape of his psyche. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He found himself staying late every night, not to work, but to wait. He had to hear it again, to confirm that it wasn't a hallucination, a figment of a stressed mind. His routine shifted, his carefully constructed life now revolving around the janitor's schedule. He learned her routine by a kind of silent observation. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening at precisely 9 o'clock, she would arrive at the atrium. She would set down her cleaning cart, and for exactly 10 minutes she would sing to the empty space. It was a ritual of quiet reverence. She never saw him, a shadow in the darkness above, watching from the safety of his office window. He was a voyeur to her private symphony. He started to see her as more than just a janitor. She was a vessel for the memory. He saw the way she held her mop, the small, almost imperceptible sway of her body as she sang, the peaceful look on her face. Her voice was not just a sound. It was a story, a history, a piece of a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. The haunting melody was not just a song. It was an unanswered question. Who was the woman in his memory? Why had his father kept her a secret? And why did this stranger, this woman named Alina, hold the key to a part of himself he didn't know was missing? Julian Vance, the man who had all the answers, now found himself lost in a mystery that threatened to unravel his entire identity. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. For the first time in his life, he was driven by something other than ambition. He was driven by a need for truth, a longing for a connection he didn't know he had lost. The corporate world, with its predictable rules and clear objectives, had been a comfortable cage. The song was the sound of the lock clicking open, and Julian knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't simply close the door and forget what he had heard. The melody was a ghost, and it was demanding to be heard. The haunting melody became Julian's private tormentor. His corner office, once a sanctuary of control, now felt like a cage where the ghost of a song rattled its chains. The merger, a deal he had spent months meticulously crafting, now felt like a distraction, a flimsy veil over a profound and unsettling mystery. He couldn't focus. The spreadsheets were a blur of numbers, the legal jargon an unintelligible mess. He was a man adrift in his own empire. He became a creature of the night, a silent observer in his own building. He learned Alina's cleaning schedule by heart. She was a woman of routine, a fact that both comforted and unsettled him. Every Tuesday and Thursday at precisely 9 in the evening, he would turn off his office lights and retreat into the shadows, watching her from the 41st floor. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He was a silent patron, a man desperate to hear a song that held the key to a past he couldn't remember. He observed her from a distance, seeing her not as the janitor, but as the vessel of his lost memory. He saw her mop the floor with a rhythmic grace, her body swaying gently as if in a private dance. When she sang, her eyes were closed, her face a mask of serene concentration. The lullaby, a melody of sorrow and hope, filled the vast, empty atrium, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment. He was a man of logic, and yet he found himself utterly captivated by this illogical and deeply emotional ritual. His search for the song's origin became his new obsession. Julian, the man who had built a tech empire on data and algorithms, turned his formidable resources to a deeply personal quest. He began with what he had, a fragment of a melody. He hummed the tune into his phone's voice recorder, then ran the audio file through a sophisticated sound recognition program. It was a long shot, but he had to try. The program returned thousands of hits, from obscure folk artists to pop songs with similar chord progressions. He had to be more specific. He began to search for lullabies from West Africa, based on the rhythmic and tonal qualities of the song. He pored through old ethnographic recordings, digital archives of global folk music, and academic papers on music history. He became a self-taught expert on a subject he had never cared about before. He learned about the oral traditions of Ghana, the call-and-response patterns of Nigerian songs, and the pentatonic scales of Malian melodies. His search led him to a doctoral thesis on West African lullabies, where he finally found it. A transcript of the song's lyrics, a beautiful poem about a child's safe journey into dreams. The song was a tribute to a mother's love and protection. The thesis identified the song as originating from the Ashanti people of Ghana, and it was traditionally sung by grandmothers to their grandchildren. He was getting closer. He now had a name for the song and an origin, but that didn't explain why it was so familiar to him. His father had never mentioned any connection to Ghana. His mother was a woman from old money, her family line meticulously documented in American and European history. There was no link, no logical explanation. The only possible connection was the woman in his fragmented memories, the nanny who had been erased from his history. Julian began to run background checks. He started with the janitorial staff at Syntech, a long and arduous process. He was looking for any connection to Ghana, any mention of a grandmother who sang lullabies. He filtered through employment records, looking for any link, any sign that could lead him to Alina. He found her name, Alina Mensa. The surname was a clue. Mensa was a common Akan name, a tribe from the Ashanti region of Ghana. He felt a jolt of recognition, a flash of something akin to hope. He had to get closer. He couldn't just confront her with a name and a song. He needed to find a way to talk to her, to connect with her without scaring her off. He was a CEO, a figure of remote power. She was a janitor. The power dynamic was immense and uncomfortable. He couldn't simply walk up to her and say, "That song you sing, I think it's a key to my past. Can you tell me about it?" It would be too strange, too intrusive. He decided on a different approach. He would create a reason to talk to her, a legitimate pretext. He began to stay late every night, working on a document, but his real work was a different kind of project. He was building a bridge, a carefully constructed path from his world to hers. He was searching for a connection, a single thread of humanity that could bind them together. The melody had started the process, but now he had to take the next step. The billionaire CEO, a man who had built his empire on detachment and control, was now a man consumed by an ancient lullaby and a janitor who sang it. The corporate tower of Syntech Solutions, once a symbol of his power, was now a silent stage for a deeply personal drama, a quest for a truth that lay buried beneath layers of wealth, privilege, and a carefully constructed lie. The tension between Julian's new obsession and his old life was a constant, gnawing presence. He was a CEO in name, but in practice, he was a detective, his case a personal one with the highest stakes imaginable. His late nights were no longer about mergers and acquisitions. They were about listening to a song and piecing together a past that had been deliberately buried. He knew her name now, Alina Mensa, and he knew her family had ties to the Ashanti people of Ghana. He also knew that his own family history, as his father had presented it, was a carefully crafted lie. He couldn't continue to be a ghost in his own building. The silence of his observation felt cowardly and unproductive. The time for passive listening was over. He needed to act. But how does a billionaire CEO approach a janitor without it feeling like an act of charity, or worse, an interrogation? The chasm between their worlds felt wider than the Atlantic Ocean. His opportunity came on a Thursday evening, a little past 9. Alina had just finished her song and was about to push her cleaning cart toward the service elevator. Julian descended in his private lift, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his first major business pitch. He rehearsed his opening lines in his head, each one feeling more awkward than the last. "Hello, I'm Julian Vance. That's a beautiful song. Too formal. I've heard you singing. Too creepy." He settled on a simple, direct approach. He found her waiting for the service elevator, her back to him. The melody, though no longer sung aloud, still seemed to cling to her. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said. His voice, usually so commanding, came out a little softer than he intended. Alina turned, her expression one of polite surprise. She had seen him from a distance, of course. The CEO was an almost mythical figure in the building, a remote and powerful man who rarely spoke to anyone outside of his executive team. She half expected him to ask her to clean a spill or perform some other menial task. Mr. Vance, she said, her voice a calm and pleasant surprise to him. I heard you singing, he began, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. That song, it's beautiful. Where did you learn it? Alina's face grew guarded. She was used to being invisible in this building. An unscheduled conversation with the boss felt strange and slightly intimidating. It's a family song, she said, her voice losing some of its warmth. My grandmother taught me. Julian nodded, trying to appear nonchalant, as if he asked his employees about their family traditions every day. It sounds familiar to me, he said, hoping she wouldn't see through the thin facade of his casual interest. It's a lullaby, isn't it, from Ghana? Her eyes widened slightly. Yes, she said, a new spark of curiosity in her gaze. How did you know that? I did some research, he admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. He saw the trust in her eyes waver. He was an outsider, a man with too much power, a man who had just admitted to a strange and unsettling hobby. He had to pivot to explain, to make her understand. I know this is odd, he continued, speaking quickly, but the melody, it's been playing in my head for days. It reminds me of something, a memory I can't quite grasp, a long time ago. I think I had a nanny who sang it to me. He watched her face, searching for a sign of recognition, a flicker of something that could connect their two disparate worlds. Alina's expression softened. She saw the genuine confusion and longing in his eyes. This wasn't a powerful CEO playing a game. This was a man searching for a ghost. It's an old Ashanti lullaby, she said, her voice now filled with a different kind of warmth. It's a song for children to let them know they are loved and safe. She told him about her grandmother, a woman she called Nana, and the stories Nana had told her about growing up in Ghana. Would you be willing to sing it for me again? Julian asked, his voice a low, almost pleading whisper. I know this is a strange request. I'll pay you for your time. As a consultant. He fumbled for his wallet, pulling out a crisp $100 bill, an awkward and completely inappropriate gesture. Alina gently pushed his hand away. You don't need to pay me, Mr. Vance, she said, a small, kind smile on her face. I'll sing for you, but not here. She looked around the atrium at the cold, empty space. This is not the right place for it. She led him to a small, secluded lounge on the second floor, a place of soft lighting and comfortable chairs. It was a space designed for casual meetings, but tonight it felt like a sacred chamber. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The melody filled the room, but this time it was different. It was sung for him, not for an empty space. It was a private gift, a bridge between two people who, by all accounts, should have had nothing to say to each other. As she sang, Julian closed his eyes. The fragmented images from his mind began to coalesce. The small boy, the warm woman, the scent of cinnamon. He could almost feel her rocking him, her voice a steady anchor in a world of uncertainty. When she finished, the silence in the room was deafening, but it was a comfortable silence, filled with unspoken truths. Thank you, Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. I think I remember her. My nanny, I need to know more. He looked at her, a man of power now utterly dependent on a woman he had only just met. Please, can you tell me more about your grandmother, her life, her stories? Alina saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes. It was a side of Julian Vance no one at Syntech Solutions had ever seen. She agreed. She would tell him her family's story, a story that was, to her surprise, now intertwined with his own. The cautious encounter had become a cautious alliance, a first step on a journey back to a past he had been taught to forget. The quiet lounge on the second floor became their sanctuary, a place of shared stories and fragile trust. Over the course of several evenings, Julian and Alina met after hours, the corporate world of Syntech Solutions a silent backdrop to a deeply personal excavation. Alina, initially hesitant, found herself opening up to Julian. She shared stories of her grandmother, a woman she called Nana, who had immigrated to the United States and worked tirelessly to build a new life. Nana was a repository of history, a living library of tales from Ghana, and the source of the beautiful lullaby that had now connected two people from entirely different worlds. As Alina spoke, Julian felt the missing pieces of his life begin to click into place. The faint images of a warm, smiling woman holding him as a child became clearer, more vivid. The scent of cinnamon, the feeling of safety, it all resonated with Alina's descriptions of her grandmother's loving presence. He felt a profound sense of loss for a past he had never known, but also a growing sense of hope that the truth was finally within his grasp. One evening, as Alina finished a particularly poignant story about Nana's struggles and triumphs, Julian felt a surge of emotion he hadn't experienced in years. He realized he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He had to show her the evidence, the one tangible link he had to his forgotten past. I have something I want to show you, he said, his voice low and serious. It's in my office. Alina followed him, her heart thumping with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. His office, a space of sterile modernity, was a testament to his power and success. He walked over to a bookshelf, not one filled with books, but with a few carefully curated artifacts, a bronze sculpture, a framed document, and a small, leather-bound photo album. He handled it with a reverence that was completely out of character for the man she knew. He opened the album and flipped through a few pages, stopping at a faded, sepia-toned photograph. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. It was a picture of a young boy, no older than 4 or 5, with a woman sitting on the floor beside him. The boy was him, a ghost of his former self, a child whose eyes held a flicker of a forgotten joy. The woman, however, was the focus of the image. She was black, with a kind, gentle face, a radiant smile, and a colorful headscarf. Her hand was resting on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of profound affection. "My mother was very ill during my early years," Julian explained, his voice barely a whisper. "This woman was our nanny, my father. He told me she had to leave after my mother passed away. He never spoke of her again." He looked at the photograph, his eyes filled with an unshed grief. "I've always assumed she was just a nanny, but when I heard your song, I remembered this." Alina took the photo album, her hands shaking slightly. She stared at the photograph, her breath catching in her throat. Her gaze was not on the young Julian, but on the woman beside him. A profound silence filled the room, a silence that was more powerful than any sound. She traced the woman's face with her finger, a look of disbelief dawning on her face. "This is," she began, her voice a tremor, "this is my Nana." Julian's heart stopped. He had hoped for a connection, for a piece of the puzzle, but he hadn't dared to dream it would be this complete, this perfect. The woman in the photo was the woman whose songs and stories Alina had been telling him for days. The kind, loving woman who had cared for him in his earliest years, who had been erased from his history by his father, was the very same woman whose granddaughter was now working in his building. Alina was overcome with emotion. She had heard her grandmother tell stories of working for a wealthy family, of caring for a little boy whose mother was sick. Her Nana had been forced to leave, and it was a source of great sadness for her, but she had never mentioned the name of the family. Now, here was the proof, a faded photograph that connected the two of them in a way that was more profound than any business deal or corporate hierarchy. The weight of the photograph was immense. Julian and Alina sat in the silent, imposing office, the small picture between them serving as a bridge across decades and social strata. The sterile air of Syntech Solutions was now filled with the unspoken truths of a shared history. Julian, the billionaire CEO, felt a sense of profound clarity, as if a thick fog had finally lifted from his mind. He now understood the source of his emotional detachment, the reason for the void in his past. His father hadn't just omitted a part of his history, he had deliberately erased a source of love and comfort. Alina, still holding the photo, was overwhelmed. The stories her grandmother had told her were not just family lore, they were pieces of a larger hidden narrative that involved the very man who owned the building she cleaned. The woman in the photograph, her beloved Nana, was now revealed to have been more than a simple nanny. She had been a source of genuine affection for a child who had lost his mother, a surrogate parent whose presence had been deemed inconvenient by a father determined to move on. "My Nana, she never told me the name of the family," Alina said, her voice a mix of awe and sorrow. "She would only say that they were very wealthy and that she had loved the little boy she cared for like her own son. She had to leave suddenly, and it broke her heart." Julian felt a wave of guilt wash over him. His father's actions had caused not only his own profound loneliness, but also the pain of a woman who had given him so much. "My father, he was a man of his time," Julian said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He believed in moving forward. My mother's illness and death were a source of great pain for him, and he chose to erase anything that reminded him of that period." He ran a hand through his hair, the perfect composure he had spent a lifetime cultivating now completely shattered. "He told me she left of her own accord, that she had a new opportunity. It was a lie." The full story began to unravel, piece by piece. Julian confessed that he had suffered a head injury in a car accident as a child, an event that had likely caused his amnesia. His father had used this as an opportunity, a clean slate to rewrite Julian's past in a way that suited his own narrative. He had replaced the loving nanny with a stern housekeeper and had systematically removed all traces of his early childhood, leaving Julian with a carefully constructed, sanitized history. The lullaby and the fragmented memory it had triggered were the only things that had survived his father's cleansing. Alina listened, her heart aching for the little boy in the photograph. "My Nana, she often spoke of a little boy who loved to build things with blocks and how she would sing to him to help him sleep. She called him son because his smile was so bright." She looked at Julian, seeing the echo of that smile in his features. She said she never forgot his face. Julian's eyes welled with tears, a rare and startling display of emotion. The nickname, Son, was a tender memory, a name he had never heard before but felt deep in his bones. It was a word of love, a word that contrasted so sharply with the cold, formal life his father had built for him. The emotional walls he had built over decades, walls of logic, reason, and detachment, were crumbling. The song wasn't just a key to a memory, it was a key to his heart. He realized the irony of the situation. He had spent his life building an empire based on logic and data, a world where emotions were a liability. But here, in his own office, a single act of kindness, a janitor singing a song to an empty room, had revealed the truth he had been missing. His entire life was built on a foundation of lies, and the only genuine, beautiful thing to come out of it was the melody that had found its way back to him. "I need to see her," Julian said, his voice filled with a desperate urgency. "Your grandmother. I need to thank her. I need to tell her. I remember." Elena, seeing the raw vulnerability in his eyes, felt a profound sense of compassion. She knew this was a journey he had to take, not just for himself, but for the little boy he once was. "She's frail now, but her mind is still sharp," Elena said. "I know she would want to see you." The corporate tower of Syntech Solutions, once a symbol of Julian's isolated power, was now the starting point of a deeply personal pilgrimage. The man who had everything was now on a quest for the one thing he had lost, his past. The silence in the office was no longer an oppressive void, but a hopeful anticipation of the journey to come. The truth, finally revealed, was not a burden but a liberation. It was a truth that had been waiting for him, tucked away in the heart of a lullaby, and the kind voice of a woman who, by a twist of fate, had become his unexpected guide. The revelation in his office had been a seismic event, cracking the carefully constructed edifice of Julian's life. He had spent a lifetime believing he was a self-made man, a creature of pure intellect. Now he understood that he was a product of a lie, a boy whose past had been deliberately erased to fit his father's narrative. The photograph, the lullaby, and Elena's stories had not just unlocked his memories, they had unlocked a profound need for closure. He had to see the woman who had loved him, the woman who had carried his memory in her heart for over 30 years. The journey to Elena's grandmother's house was a quiet, contemplative one. Julian drove, not in his usual sleek, armored car, but in a more modest vehicle he'd borrowed from the company's motor pool, an attempt to shed the symbols of his power. The drive took them from the glittering cityscape of his empire into a quiet, residential neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. He felt like an imposter, a man of glass towers and digital empires venturing into a world of front porches and manicured lawns. Elena directed him to a small, single-story house with a vibrant garden filled with sunflowers and marigolds. The scent of blooming flowers and fresh-baked bread hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, recycled air of his office. Julian felt a strange mix of nerves and anticipation. This was more than a meeting. It was a pilgrimage to his own forgotten past. Elena's grandmother, Nana, sat in a rocking chair on the porch, a colorful quilt draped over her knees. She was a small, frail woman, her skin a beautiful roadmap of a long life lived. Her eyes, however, were as sharp and clear as a young woman's. When she saw Julian, a look of profound shock and recognition crossed her face. She slowly stood up, her movements unsteady, and extended a hand, her gaze fixed on his face. "Son," she said, her voice a soft, weathered whisper. The sound of the nickname sent a shiver down Julian's spine, a deep resonance of a love he had never known he had lost. Julian took her hand, his own large and powerful hand dwarfed by her delicate, gnarled one. He knelt on the porch, a CEO on his knees before a woman who had once been his whole world. "Nana," he said, the name feeling both new and impossibly old on his tongue. Tears streamed down his face, a torrent of grief for the lost years and a joy for the rediscovery. Nana pulled him into a tight, surprisingly strong embrace. He smelled cinnamon and something floral, the same scents from his fragmented memory. She rocked him gently, just as she had when he was a boy, and began to hum the lullaby that had brought them together. Julian wept, a man undone by a simple song and the love of a woman he had never known. Inside the house, over cups of fragrant tea, Nana began to tell him the full story. She spoke of his mother, a woman of great kindness and a fragile constitution. Nana had been her nurse and confidant, and Julian's primary caregiver. "Your mother," she said, her eyes distant with memory, "was a beautiful soul. She loved you so much, my son. I promised her I would always care for you." She then spoke of Julian's father, a man of power and ambition. He was not a cruel man, Nana insisted, but a man who was deeply uncomfortable with grief. "He wanted to erase the sadness," she explained. "When your mother died, he wanted to forget everything about her illness. He thought that if he removed me, a reminder of that time, the grief would go away." Nana had been dismissed with a week's notice and a generous but impersonal severance package. She had been heartbroken. She had loved Julian, the little boy she called son, and had not wanted to leave. But Julian's father had been firm and unyielding. The car accident, a few months later, had provided him with an opportunity. When Julian lost his memory, his father had simply rewritten history. I tried to find you, Nana said, her eyes now filled with tears. I went back to the house, but you were gone. Your father had moved you. I never forgot you, my son. I never stopped singing that song, hoping one day somehow you would hear it and remember. Julian listened, a man grappling with a past that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. He had been a loved child, a boy with a nanny who adored him and a mother who cherished him. He had also been a child of a man who, in his grief, had caused profound and lasting damage. The coldness of his father, the emotional distance, it all made sense now. Julian wasn't a product of a cold, emotionless life. He was a victim of it. He had been a boy with a full heart that had been systematically emptied. He looked at Alina, his guide on this incredible journey. She had been the unwitting key to his past, a random chance encounter in the silent halls of his corporate empire that had led him to this moment of truth. He saw her not as a janitor, but as the heir to a beautiful legacy, a legacy of love and compassion that had found its way back to him through the simple, powerful act of a song. The corporate world, with its grand mergers and acquisitions, felt small and insignificant in comparison to the profound and human story that had just been revealed. The small house on the quiet street felt like a world away from the gleaming monolith of Syntech Solutions. Julian, his heart full and heavy, listened to Nana's stories, a tapestry of forgotten memories and unspoken truths. He had always known his father as a cold, distant man, a powerful figure in the world of business, but emotionally absent in Julian's life. Now he understood why. His father wasn't a monster. He was a man undone by grief, a man who, in his pain, had made a choice that had cost his son his past. Your father, he was a good man in his way, Nana said, her voice a soft, gentle defense. But he was a man who saw the world as a problem to be solved, and your mother's passing and my presence were problems to him. I was a constant reminder of the sadness he wanted to forget. She explained how his father had tried to buy her silence, offering her a large sum of money to sign a non-disclosure agreement and never contact the family again. Nana had refused the money, heartbroken by the thought of being erased from the life of the boy she had come to love. Julian felt a deep well of sorrow for the boy he once was, a boy who had been deprived of the love and comfort of a woman who had adored him. He felt a newfound sense of clarity about his own life. The relentless pursuit of wealth, the cold ambition, the inability to form genuine connections, it was all a reflection of the life his father had built for him. He had been a mirror of his father's emotional detachment, a man who had replaced love and connection with numbers and data. But now, with the truth laid bare, the mirror was shattered, and he was finally able to see himself. He looked at Alina, his guide on this incredible journey. She had been the unwitting key to his past, a random chance encounter in the silent halls of his corporate empire that had led him to this moment of truth. He saw her not as a janitor, but as the heir to a beautiful legacy, a legacy of love and compassion that had found its way back to him through the simple, powerful act of a song. He realized the irony of it all. He, a man who had built his empire on the very foundation of cold, hard logic, had been saved by the most illogical of things, a melody and a connection forged in the past. Over the next few weeks, Julian's life began to change in profound and unexpected ways. The merger with Quantum Dynamics, a deal he had been so obsessed with, now felt insignificant. He found himself questioning the very foundation of his business, the relentless pursuit of profit at the expense of all else. He began to see his employees not as cogs in a machine, but as people with lives, stories, and connections. He started to make small, human changes to the company's culture. He instituted a mentorship program, giving younger employees opportunities to learn from senior executives. He started a company-wide initiative to support local community projects, an idea that had been completely alien to him just a few weeks prior. But the most significant change was the one he made to his own life. He began to spend more time with Alina and Nana. He would drive to their house on weekends, not as the powerful CEO, but as a man seeking to reclaim his past. He would sit with Nana, listening to her stories of Ghana, of her family, and of his mother. He learned about the woman who had brought him into the world, a woman who had loved him fiercely and had a gentle, artistic soul. He saw the world not just through the lens of a spreadsheet, but through the rich, human tapestry of a life he had been denied. The old lullaby, the haunting melody that had once tormented him, now became a source of comfort and healing. He would often ask Alina to sing it for him, and as she did, the fragmented memories of his childhood would flood his mind, no longer blurry and indistinct, but vivid and real. He was no longer the boy with amnesia, the man with a blank past. He was Julian, the boy Nana called son, a man with a heart that, after a lifetime of silence, was finally beginning to beat again. The corporate tower of Syntech Solutions, once a symbol of his isolated power, was now a place of reflection and change. He looked out at the city, no longer as a silent king, but as a man connected to the world, to a family he had never known, and to a past he had finally reclaimed. The truth, finally revealed, was not a burden but a liberation, and it had set him on a new path, a path of empathy, connection, and a future built not on numbers, but on the enduring power of a song. Julian's world, once a fortress of logic and cold ambition, had been utterly transformed by a lullaby and the woman who sang it. The visit to Nana's home had been a turning point, a powerful confrontation with his own forgotten past. He was no longer the man with a blank slate. He was a man with a rich, if painful, history, and a newfound sense of empathy he hadn't known he was capable of. The cold, sterile corporate tower of Syntech Solutions, once his kingdom, now felt like a stage where he had been playing a role he no longer believed in. He returned to his office with a purpose far grander than any merger. The spreadsheets and financial models now seemed like the flimsy decorations of a life built on a lie. He saw his company not as a machine for profit, but as a community of people, each with their own stories, their own lullabies. He began to make changes, subtle at first, then more profound. He instituted a work-life balance policy, a radical concept in the cutthroat world of Syntech. He created a fund for employees facing personal crises, a stark contrast to the company's previous, heartless approach to its human resources. But the most significant change was the one he made to Alina. He saw her not as a janitor, but as a link to his past and a bridge to his future. He invited her to his office one evening, not as a superior, but as a friend. She was hesitant, the old power dynamic still lingering in the air. He sat her down and offered her a cup of tea, the same kind she had served him at Nana's house. "Alina," he began, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You and that song have given me back my past. You've shown me a side of myself I never knew existed." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't want you to be a janitor here anymore." Alina's heart sank. She thought he was firing her, that this was his awkward way of severing their newfound connection and returning to his old life. "I understand," she said, her voice filled with a quiet dignity. "Thank you for everything." "No, you don't understand," Julian said, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "I'm offering you a new position. I want you to be my executive assistant." Alina was stunned into silence. The offer was not just a promotion, it was a revolution. The idea of her, a janitor working side by side with the CEO, was unthinkable. "Mr. Vance," she stammered, "I don't have the experience. I'm not qualified." Julian leaned forward, his eyes filled with a new kind of fire. "You are more qualified than anyone I've ever met," he said. "You have a wisdom and an empathy that no business school can teach. You've taught me more about life in the last few weeks than I've learned in my entire career. I need that perspective. I need you to keep me grounded, to remind me of what's truly important." He explained that he would provide all the training she needed, that her primary role would be to keep him from losing touch with his own humanity. Alina, still in shock, found herself saying yes. The offer was a leap of faith, a leap from the familiar world of mops and buckets to the unknown world of spreadsheets and boardrooms. But she had seen a different side of Julian, a vulnerable, searching man, and she felt a sense of loyalty to him, to the boy he once was. Julian, filled with a newfound sense of purpose, didn't stop there. He wanted to honor Nana, the woman who had kept his memory alive. He announced a new corporate initiative, the Nana's Legacy Fund, a foundation dedicated to preserving West African cultural heritage. The foundation would provide grants for artists, musicians, and storytellers from Ghana and other West African nations. He made the initial donation himself, a sum so large it would ensure the foundation's work for decades to come. He saw the foundation as a tribute, a way of giving back to the culture that had given him so much. It was a testament to the power of a single song, a melody that had not only resurrected his past but had also changed the course of his future. The corporate world, with its cold calculus of profit, was now a vehicle for something more meaningful, a force for good in the world. Julian Vance, the Billionaire CEO, was a changed man, and his company was changing with him. The old symphony of ambition and greed was being replaced by a new harmony, a melody of empathy, connection, and a future built on the enduring power of a song. The final chapter of Julian Vance's old life was written in the quiet stillness of his office, but the beginning of his new life was a vibrant, ongoing story. The corporate tower of Syntech Solutions, once a silent monument to his solitude, now buzzed with a different kind of energy. Julian, no longer a remote and distant figure, walked the halls with a new purpose. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a leader, a mentor, and most importantly, a human being. Alina, now Julian's executive assistant, was the quiet architect of this new era. She moved through the office with a grace and confidence she had never known she possessed. Her work was no longer about cleaning floors, it was about connecting people. She helped Julian navigate the complexities of his new persona, reminding him of what was truly important. She was his sounding board, his conscience, and his most trusted advisor. Their relationship was a testament to the power of a single song. They weren't just CEO and employee. They were friends, bound by a shared history and a profound sense of mutual respect. They would often meet for lunch in the company cafeteria, a place Julian had never set foot in before. They would talk about everything, from the company's new initiatives to the latest stories from Nana. Their conversations were a blend of business and life, a perfect harmony of two worlds that had once been so separate. The Nana's Legacy Fund was a resounding success. Julian had named Alina as a co-director, a move that surprised many but made perfect sense to those who knew their story. The fund quickly became a beacon of hope for artists and storytellers from Ghana, a tribute to the power of culture and the importance of preserving history. The fund's first major grant went to a young Ghanaian musician who was creating a digital archive of traditional lullabies, a project that held a special significance for both Julian and Alina. The corporate culture at Syntech Solutions underwent a profound transformation. The old mantra of profit above all else was replaced by a new philosophy of people first. Julian started a program called The Human Element, a series of company-wide events where employees could share their stories, their passions, and their dreams. He would often speak at these events, sharing his own story, a tale of a man who found his past in the most unexpected of places. One evening, Julian and Alina were working late in his office. The city lights below twinkled like a million tiny stars, a different kind of symphony than the one they had first shared. Julian paused his work, his gaze fixed on the city below. "You know," he said, "I used to see this city as a battlefield, a place to conquer. Now I see it as a community, a place to belong." Alina smiled, a warm and genuine smile that had become a familiar sight in the office. "That's what Nana would say," she said. "She always said that a person is not a person without other people." Julian nodded, a sense of profound peace settling over him. He realized that the greatest merger he had ever been a part of was not with quantum dynamics, but with his own humanity. The CEO, a man who had once been a prisoner of his past, was now a free man, a man who had found his way home. He turned to Alina, a look of gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling too small for the magnitude of his feelings. "Thank you for the song. Thank you for Nana. Thank you for everything." Alina didn't say anything. She simply smiled and began to hum the old lullaby, the melody that had started it all. The sound filled the office, no longer a haunting ghost but a beautiful, comforting presence. Julian closed his eyes, and for the first time in his life he wasn't just hearing the song, he was feeling it, a part of a beautiful and enduring harmony. The final chapter of his story was not an ending, but a beginning, a future filled with joy and connection.